And now on the line is Professor Matthew Sadlier, a consultant psychiatrist. Matthew, welcome to Near FM.
Thanks very much. Good morning.
Okay, Matthew, I got in touch with you for today's interview for two main reasons. First of all, I heard you on Drive Time on RT Radio recently talking about cannabis. And secondly, I want to find out if you think that the current Citizens' Assembly on drugs use is a worthwhile endeavour. First of all, I smoked cannabis, which was hash, fairly regularly for a few years when I was a teenager in the mid to late 90s. A lot of people know this, Matthew, but I think a lot of other people don't know it. The situation and harm of cannabis in Ireland over the last 20 years has changed a lot, hasn't it?
It has. I mean, the usage of cannabis has gone up significantly over the last 20, 30 years. And with the increase in usage, obviously you're going to get increase in harm. And that is the thing that I'm trying to highlight at the moment and the sort of campaign that we're on. I mean, the main issue we're trying to get out there is that, cannabis is a dangerous drug, similar to alcohol, similar to tobacco, and similar to other drugs that are illegal. And our campaign really is to try to say that the best prevention for addiction is not using and not starting. Now, as I say, similar to tobacco smoking or similar to alcohol, does everybody who uses cannabis get badly harmed by it? No, they don't. And I'd be lying to you if I said they were, right? And we all know that. But at the same time, many, many people who do use it do get badly harmed by it. And both themselves and their family, whether it's because they fall into addiction, whether it is because of, similar to alcohol, they run into trouble because of, driving while under the influence or have an accident or cause a tragedy, or that they develop other illnesses which we know are associated with increased cannabis risk. So the main thing I'm calling for is to ensure that we have a public health campaign out there, depending on whatever way the Citizens' Assembly decides and then the government decides after that, to ensure that we have a public health campaign out there, like we do with tobacco, like we do with alcohol, that says, this is a dangerous substance, people should be using it as little as possible. And as I always use the mantra that Ireland has a campaign which most people who listen to your radio show will know, called Tobacco Free Ireland. Tobacco Free Ireland has been incredibly successful. It's got smoking in this country from 65% of the population down to about 17%, which is really good. And you can see this in the hospitals, with the reduction in the number of people being diagnosed with lung disease. I would think that we need a similar sort of Cannabis Free Ireland campaign, which says, look, cannabis can cause mental health problems, especially if people who have a family history or are vulnerable to mental health problems. Because you smoke cannabis, or most people smoke cannabis, I know there's different ways of taking it, it also does cause lung problems. And if you have asthma or if you have any lung disease, you really shouldn't be, inhaling any type of smoke, whether it's tobacco smoke, cannabis smoke. Your lungs aren't designed to be taken in, smoke into them. So these are the sort of messages that I'm really keen that we get across, because there is a sort of a message out there, especially among the youth, that cannabis is a sort of almost, an almost herbal supplement, and it's almost a health food, if that, and we're trying to say, look, if you want to take it, personal choice is personal choice, but that people are informed when they're making that personal choice that this substance is an unhealthy substance. It leads to both mental health and physical health problems.
Okay, you've kind of already answered this next question, but I have heard that most of the people who smoke cannabis in Ireland nowadays smoke strong quality weed, whereas when I was a teenager in the 1990s it was hash. But would I be right in saying, Matthew, that you and most of your colleagues in psychiatry in Ireland don't think that the old hash is much safer?
So yeah, absolutely. The cannabis plant is one of the most genetically modified plants on the planet. Okay, and the people who are producing cannabis for sale have constantly been trying to genetically modify the plant so that there is more of a substance called THC, which is the substance that makes people feel high and is the one that is linked with a higher risk of mental health problems, and a lower substance called CBD, which is the one that potentially has some medical benefits. Okay, Hash, the old school hash that that people would have smoked 20, 30 years ago, would have had a THC concentration of in the single digits. So we're talking 4, 5, 6, maybe 7%. Now there is cannabis is coming out with a much higher THC component, which means that the CBD component obviously, is less, because if one thing is higher, the other thing has to be lower. And that is more dangerous for your mental health. That has a much higher risk of developing psychosis and a much higher risk of, longer term consequences. And but we've seen this with all drugs of abuse, over time, and you could argue, absolutely, somebody could say the same argument to me between beer and whiskey. And absolutely, but we do tend to drink a pint of beer and only 25 millilitres of whiskey. If you try to drink, while we tend to smoke one joint of strong cannabis or one joint of weaker cannabis. So, absolutely, the stronger stuff that is out there is more dangerous and compared to the weaker stuff that used to be out there in the old days, or the stuff that people, might grow themselves or grow in small quantities.
Yeah, a perception I have as well, I don't know if it's true, but a perception I have is that people who smoke cannabis nowadays in Ireland and around the world smoke a lot more of it than was smoking with hash 20 years ago. Is that true?
That seems to be the case, absolutely. It's very hard to get very definitive statistics on drugs that are illegal, okay, because it's hard, but you are right. There definitely seems to be a much higher usage coming out. And in countries like Canada, where cannabis has become legal, there's certain things like this, a thing called a hyperemesis syndrome, where somebody gets very strong vomiting that's very hard to control, which was only rarely seen, and that comes with very heavy usage of cannabis. But that's starting to be seen in Canada now, where, as I say, cannabis isn't legal, so people are smoking in much higher quantities. So that will be another one of our concerns, is that this higher, more toxic form of cannabis is getting into the market.
Okay, one thing that only registered with me a few years ago, Matthew, after I read an article by a man by the name of Robin Foote, he said that alcohol in any dose actually kills the drinker's brain cells when drank. Can you tell me if this analysis is correct, Matthew? And if it is, could you tell me whether the same thing happens when smoking cannabis?
Well, no, it is correct. And like, if alcohol was licensed today, if somebody invented alcohol in the morning, I don't think it would be legal, or we would be in the same discussions that we are about cannabis, whether or not to legalize it. Absolutely. If alcohol was a food supplement, the annual safe dose would be, 1 glass of wine a year. Yes. Now, but the one predictable thing about alcohol is a very small amount of alcohol causes a relatively small amount of harm, and from a physical state. And there's a question to be said: does the social benefit, of community, of the little bit of anxiety that it relieves, and the mild bit of euphoria, does that give a benefit? There's an argument to be said of that with small quantities of alcohol, but certainly when you get to any larger quantity of alcohol, absolutely the toxic effects take over. Okay, and we know that, and we know alcohol very well, because alcohol has been around for a long time and we studied it a lot. Cannabis seems to have a toxic effect on the brain as well. Does it actually kill brain cells? Yes, in high doses, if people use it over a long period of time. It does. In short doses over a short period of time, it wouldn't necessarily have the same effect as it does. And again, cannabis is a little bit like alcohol, where the quantity of how much people take is very relevant to the harmful effects. And I would just, for your listeners, compare that to something like cocaine, for example, where even a tiny dose of cocaine can, cause a very strong detrimental effect to somebody and can make somebody psychotic and can cause huge problems, where it's compared to something like cannabis or alcohol, where there does tend to be, a small amount causes less harm, a big amount causes greater harm.
You're a consultant psychiatrist. Do you deal with all different age groups, and do you deal with people who have all different kinds of addictions?
So over my career, in the last few years, I have specialised in what we would call older age psychiatry. And in older age psychiatry, I mainly deal with dementia. And this is the final thing I'd say about cannabis, which is, now, absolutely, you could say to me, does similar things happen to alcohol? And I'd say it does, which is that if people use heavy cannabis for a long period in their life, there is evidence out there to suggest that there's potentially, as they get older, that might put them at a much higher risk of developing dementia. We don't really have good evidence on this. And again, because cannabis is an illegal drug, it's very hard to get good quantity evidences on these things. But there definitely was a very good study published in the American Journal of Psychiatry, which showed that in people who had a high use of cannabis in their 40s, they actually had a lower IQ than people who hadn't a high use of cannabis. And if you bring that forward from their 40s into their 50s and 60s, that could lead to a much higher risk of dementia. So that would be my own personal specialty in this. And it's just one of the unknowns of cannabis. My feeling from sort of reading the research and looking at the physiology of it, I would feel that somebody who takes cannabis at a high level for a long period of time is definitely putting themselves at a higher risk of developing dementia in their later years.
Okay, I won't keep
and that's similar to alcohol. And just for your listeners, that is similar to alcohol. Like if somebody drinks a lot of alcohol, alcohol-related dementia is a very real disease that we see every day in our hospitals.
Okay, I won't keep you much longer, Matt. You mentioned there that there hasn't unfortunately yet been a lot of studies done on that, the connection between cannabis and dementia yet. But one other drug I have experience of from when I was a teenager, and I generally just did two drugs, cannabis, but the other one was ecstasy. I did it for a year on the weekends. Am I right in saying that there hasn't also been much kind of studies done on the effects of ecstasy?
Yeah, there's been some studies done on it, and it's you see, it's hard to know with illegal drugs. If you do a survey and you ask, 100 people, have you used it? People are more open to admitting things now, but in previous years they weren't. And then the other problem is drugs like ecstasy, were very popular from about the early 1990s onwards. So if you take the people who took that in the early 90s, and let's say they were 20 then, they're only in their 50s now. So it's very hard to determine whether or not that would cause dementia, which tends to happen in your 60s and 70s. But I would say ecstasy is a bit more similar to cocaine in my previous analogy, that, a very small amount can cause a lot of harm or can cause no harm. And ecstasy is one of these drugs that's very, very, very unpredictable. People after one or two usages can have very catastrophic reactions to it, or they can have a very mild reaction to it. And that's the worry with something like ecstasy, and also the worry with any of the sort of amphetamine derivatives, which be ecstasy. Kind of cocaine is in the similar sort of chemical. They're kind of cousins of each other. Now I know some purists will kill me for saying that, but yeah, they are, and they can be very unpredictable, and that will be the big concern about them. And I'm sure anybody who's been around will have been at parties where people have taken a very small quantity of ecstasy or MDMA or something like that, and have had a very catastrophic severe reaction with paranoia, anxiety, and all these other things coming on, despite the fact that they've used only a very small amount of the drug. And then other people have used, I'd be lying to you if I hadn't said that, we all know other people have used larger quantities of those drugs and, are relatively, haven't had as many bad reactions.
Yeah, I smoked cannabis fairly regularly for 4 years. I did ecstasy for a year on the weekends. Yeah. I'd say ecstasy in the space of a year did more damage to my brain than cannabis did in 4.
I would say so. Yeah,
it's a very dangerous drug.
Yeah. It is, and especially if you're going to use it regularly. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's a very dangerous drug, and even if you don't have a life or death health scare, the side effects of it for a few days after taking it are awful. It's terrible.
Yeah.
Okay, just Matthew, to come towards the end of the interview, you've also already kind of answered this question, but the Citizens Assembly on Drug Use started last week. Do you welcome that an assembly has been set up, Matthew, or are you concerned that the assembly might recommend legalization of drugs that I understand that many people in the health profession are opposed to?
Yeah, the two things I'd say in it is, the first problem is that my only problem with the Citizens Assembly on drugs is that it's a very big topic. And I think maybe a Citizens Assembly on cannabis, or a separate one on cocaine, or a separate, that, the one Citizens Assembly trying to take in information on. So if you look at something like, and I know cocaine, for example, like there's no way you could decriminalize cocaine, because cocaine is only produced by, very large illegal drug cartels in South America and Africa. And how could you legalize, it'd be like legalizing blood diamonds or something. The supply chains of how the cocaine gets onto the street causes so much damage to humans around the developing world, and you contrast that to something like cannabis, where there is potentially a legal production industry, and the discussion on cannabis is more about the health and the public health effects. So my only concern, as I say, about the Citizens Assembly is I think a little bit too broad by making it all drugs, and they may have been better kind of focusing on, taking one drug or one substance at a time. But look, we live in a democracy. It's a democratic process. I have my opinion, which is that absolutely for people who are in addiction, we should be treating them compassionately. Should we be locking up people because they use a small amount of a drug? Absolutely not. We shouldn't. There should be health diversions, and there are health diversion policies. But at the same time, if we make these drugs too legal, too accessible, more and more people will fall into that cycle of addiction. And as a lot of your listeners will know, that cycle of addiction destroys not only a person, but it destroys their family, and in times can destroy their community. And that would be our concern. And look, we live in a democracy, and I'm very happy to the fact that I'm able to put forward my opinion. I know there's people who have a different opinion. And, ultimately it's going to be up to the Citizens Assembly and then the Oireachtas to make the decision. And, that's what we are. And, that's much better than living somewhere where the decisions are made without discussion.